My daughter's graduation dinner was supposed to be a celebration until my mother stood up and delivered a humiliating ultimatum before our entire extended family. She called me a leech and demanded I start paying rent tomorrow or get out. I simply smiled because my purse held a secret I had guarded for 15 years. It was a stack of legal documents she had conveniently forgotten, just waiting for the right moment to destroy her narrative. My name is Reagan Miles, and if there is one thing I have mastered over 4 decades of life in the humid, magnolia-scented air of North Carolina, it is the art of waiting. I sat in the center of the long, white-clothed table, my hands folded calmly in my lap, observing the scene before me with a mixture of fierce pride and cold, calculating dread. We were in the private dining room of the Gilded Oak, one of those upscale establishments in downtown Raleigh, where the steaks are priced by the ounce and the lighting is kept intentionally dim to flatter the clientele. The air conditioner hummed a low, expensive note, fighting off the May heat outside, but the temperature at our table felt artificially chilled for an entirely different reason. The room was a flurry of flash photography and clinking silverware. At the head of the table sat the reason for tonight's gathering, though you might not have known it by looking at the woman sitting to her right. My daughter, Jenna, looked radiant. She was wearing a dark blue dress that perfectly complemented her eyes, a shade of midnight navy that made her skin glow under the crystal chandelier. Draped across her shoulder was a gold and white sash that read, Honors. She had not just graduated from university earlier that afternoon, she had decimated the curriculum. Summa cum laude, a full scholarship to a graduate program that accepted less than 3% of its applicants. She was 22 years old, and she carried herself with a grace that I knew she had not inherited from her grandmother. I watched as my Aunt Cara leaned across the table, her heavy gold bracelets jangling against her wineglass. She was beaming at Jenna, her face flushed with Chardonnay and genuine affection. You simply amaze us. Jenna, Cara said, her voice carrying that distinct southern lilt that stretches vowels like taffy. I was telling Derek just the other day. I said, I do not know how that girl does it, working at the university library 20 hours a week, taking a full course load, and never once complaining. Not once. Most kids these days would have crumbled. But you just kept your head down. Uncle Derek nodded vigorously, swallowing a bite of prime rib. He pointed his fork at Jenna. It is character. That is what it is, Derek announced. You cannot teach that. You either have grit or you do not. And you, young lady, have grit in spades. Jenna smiled, a genuine, humble expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She thanked them softly, her voice melodic but firm. I watched her and felt a swell of emotions so strong it nearly choked me. I remembered the late nights she spent studying at the kitchen table while I worked quietly in the corner. I remembered the weekends she sacrificed. I remembered the specific, grinding exhaustion of trying to build a future when the foundation beneath you feels like quicksand. But my gaze did not linger on Jenna for long. It drifted, as it always did, to the true center of gravity in our family. My mother, Marilyn. Marilyn sat 2 seats away from me, upright and rigid, like a queen holding court in a kingdom she believed she ruled by divine right. She was perfectly coiffed, her hair a helmet of hairspray, her pearls resting against a silk blouse that cost more than my car insurance for 6 months. To an outsider, she looked like the picture of a proud matriarch. She was smiling. She was nodding at the compliments being thrown at her granddaughter. But I knew the code. I knew the micro-expressions that mapped the dangerous terrain of her mood. She had barely spoken to Jenna since the ceremony ended. At the graduation, she had posed for photos. Certainly. She had smiled for the Facebook uploads, making sure the lighting caught her good side, placing a possessive hand on Jenna's shoulder whenever a camera lens pointed their way. But in the car ride over, and for the last 90 minutes of dinner, her words had been sparse, sharp, and directed entirely at the guests, never the honoree. Marilyn did not like sharing the spotlight, even if the person stealing it was her own flesh and blood, especially if that person was succeeding in a way she could not take credit for. Next to her sat my father, Howard. He was physically present, occupying space in his expensive suit, but spiritually, he was miles away. He stared relentlessly at the screen of his smartphone, scrolling through emails or news feeds, anything to avoid making eye contact with the reality of the dinner table. He was a man who had turned avoidance into an art form. He chewed his food mechanically, nodding at intervals that had no correlation to the conversation, a survival mechanism honed over 40 years of marriage to a woman who required total submission. "So, what is the plan now?" Superstar cousin Mike asked from the far end of the table, raising his glass. "We hear you are off to greener pastures." The table warmed up instantly. This was safe territory. Success. Ambition. The future. "I am moving into the new graduate housing complex in August," Jenna explained, her eyes lighting up. "It is closer to the research labs. The program starts immediately, so I will be diving into the introductory seminars on data analysis before the fall semester officially kicks off. I am actually really excited about the thesis advisor I have been paired with. She is a specialist in urban economic development. That is fantastic." Aunt Kara gushed. "Just fantastic. And fully funded, Jenna confirmed, plus a stipend for living expenses." The room erupted in another round of murmurs and approval. I took a slow sip of my water, my eyes scanning the table, catching the way Marilyn's jaw tightened just a fraction of an inch. She hated this. She hated that Jenna was independent. She hated that the narrative was about Jenna's hard work and the university's recognition, rather than Marilyn's generosity. I shifted slightly in my chair, feeling the weight of the object resting against my leg. Beneath the tablecloth, propped against the leg of my chair, was a slim leather portfolio. It was battered and soft with age, distinct from the pristine designer bags the other women in the room carried. It was my gift to Jenna, not the kind of gift you wrap in shiny paper with a bow. It was a transfer of power. Inside that leather casing was a stack of documents organized with color-coded tabs. A paper trail I had been building in silence for 15 years. I had planned to give it to her later, perhaps over coffee when the rest of the family had dispersed, or maybe in the quiet of the car. But as the dinner progressed, as the air grew heavy with the unspoken tension radiating from my mother, I felt a distinct pull to keep it close. Then I saw it. Marilyn's eyes flicked down. She was looking past me, toward the floor where the portfolio rested. It was a quick, darting glance, like a lizard snapping at a fly. But I caught it. She frowned. Her eyes narrowed. Then she looked up at me, her gaze piercing and suspicious. She looked back down at the bag again. It was as if she could smell the danger emanating from it. She did not know what was inside. There was no way she could know, but Marilyn had a predator's instinct for threats. She sensed that the geometry of the evening was not quite right. She sensed that I, usually the quiet punching bag, the dutiful daughter who absorbed her barbs with a stoic nod, was sitting a little too straight. She sensed that my silence tonight was not submissive, but predatory. I met her gaze and offered a small, polite smile. It was the same smile I had worn for years, the mask of the obedient daughter. But this time, it did not reach my eyes. Marilyn looked away, agitated. She reached for her wine glass, taking a long swallow of the Cabernet. She set the glass down with a little more force than necessary. The stemware rattled against the charger plate. "So, Howard," Uncle Derek boomed, trying to bridge a lull in the conversation. "You must be relieved to have the tuition bills off your back." "Eh?" "One less check to write every semester." It was an innocent comment. Derek meant well, but the air in the room instantly curdled. Howard looked up from his phone, blinking as if waking from a trance. "Oh, yes. Well, we do what we have to do for family. We certainly do," Marilyn said. Her voice cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a serrated blade. It was the first time she had spoken in 10 minutes, and the tone was distinct. It was the tone she used before she started a fight. It was low, controlled, and laced with a performative martyrdom. I tightened my grip on the napkin in my lap. Here it comes. I thought. Jenna seemed to sense the shift too. Her smile faltered slightly. She looked at me, a silent question in her eyes. I gave her the smallest of nods, a microscopic signal that said, "Stay steady, I am here." Marilyn smoothed the napkin on her lap. She looked around the table, gathering the attention of every aunt, uncle, and cousin like a conductor raising a baton. She wanted an audience. She thrived on the collective gaze. This was her stage, and Jenna's graduation was merely the backdrop. I watched her hand reach out. She picked up a heavy silver dessert spoon. "Do not do it." I willed her silently. "Just let her have this one night. Just let us eat the cake. Pay the bill. And go home. Be a mother for 5 minutes instead of a martyr." But Marilyn was Marilyn. She could no more stop herself than a shark could stop swimming. She tapped the spoon against the side of her wine glass. Clink, clink, clink. The sound was sharp, high-pitched, and demanding. It silenced the table instantly. Uncle Derek stopped mid-chew. Aunt Cara put her glass down. Even the waiters near our station paused, trained to recognize the universal signal for a toast. But this was not going to be a toast. I knew it in the marrow of my bones. Marilyn stood up. She smoothed her skirt, waiting for absolute silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. She looked at Jenna, offering a smile that did not contain a single ounce of warmth. It was a smile that looked like it had been painted on a porcelain doll. Then she turned her gaze to the rest of the room, and finally, she locked eyes with me. Her eyes were cold. They were triumphant. They were the eyes of a woman who was about to drop a bomb and call it a blessing. I sat perfectly still, my hand brushing the leather portfolio beneath the table. I felt the cool texture of the leather. I thought of the documents inside, the deeds, the receipts, the bank statements, the truth. If you want a war, Mother, I thought, watching her inhale to speak, then you have picked the absolute worst night to start one. Marilyn cleared her throat, and the sound echoed in the sudden quiet of the room. "Everyone, if I could have your attention for a moment," she began, her voice sugary sweet, dripping with that fake Southern charm that usually preceded a public execution. I did not blink. I did not look away. I just waited. "We are all very proud of you." "Jenna," Marilyn began, her hands clasping together in front of her chest in a gesture that mimicked prayer, but felt more like a judge gripping a gavel. "It is truly wonderful that you have managed to get through school with such high marks. We know you worked hard at that little library job of yours." She paused, letting the compliment hang there just long enough for it to stale. Then came the pivot. I saw it happen in real time, the way a driver sees a deer dart onto the highway too late to brake. Inevitable impact ahead, but Marilyn continued, her voice dropping an octave, becoming serious and grave. "We also need to be realistic. This is a celebration. Yes, but it is also a gateway to the real world. And the real world does not care about honors cords or fancy sashes. The real world cares about contribution. It cares about pulling your own weight." I took a sip of water. I knew this speech. It was the standard welcome to adulthood lecture she gave to anyone under the age of 30. I assumed she was about to lecture Jenna on saving money or not expecting handouts now that she was a graduate student. Jenna nodded politely, her smile tight. "I know. Grandma, that is why I am glad the fellowship covers my." Marilyn cut her off with a sharp wave of her hand. "I am not talking about you, Jenna. You have done your part for now. I am talking about the example that has been set in this family. I am talking about the culture of dependency that we have allowed to fester under our roof for far too long." The room went very quiet. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving us in a bubble of high-tension silence. Aunt Cara looked up from her salad, confused. Uncle Derek frowned. They still thought she was speaking generally, perhaps making a commentary on millennials or the economy, favorite topics of hers at Thanksgiving. But then Marilyn turned her head. She did not look at Jenna. She did not look at Howard. She turned her entire body until she was facing me directly. Her eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "I am talking about you." "Reagan." The air left the room. "Me?" I asked, keeping my voice level, though my heart hammered against my ribs. "Yes, you," she snapped. "Look at you. You are 43 years old. You have a degree. You are supposedly an adult woman. And yet, where do you live? In the same bedroom you slept in when you were 16. You eat the food we buy. You use the electricity we pay for. You exist in our house like a ghost, drifting in and out, while your father and I carry the burden of maintaining a lifestyle you clearly cannot afford on your own." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, not from shame, but from the sheer audacity of it. The lie was so big, so bold, that it almost commanded respect. "Marilyn," Aunt Kara whispered, looking scandalized. "This is hardly the time." "It is exactly the time," Marilyn declared, her voice rising just enough to be heard by the neighboring tables. "We are celebrating Jenna's launch into the world. What better time to address the fact that her mother never actually launched? It is embarrassing. Frankly, we have friends asking us when Reagan is going to move out, when she is going to stand on her own 2 feet. And what do we tell them? We tell them she is figuring it out. Well, 43 is a little late to be figuring it out." She gestured to Howard, who was staring intently at a bread roll as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "Tell her, Howard, tell her what we discussed." My father looked up. He looked miserable. He looked like a man who was being held hostage by his own lack of spine. He glanced at me, then quickly away, his eyes darting to the safe harbor of his wife's approval. "Your mother is right, Reagan," he mumbled, his voice thick with reluctance. "The housing market is tough. We know that. But it has been years. It has been 15 years. Marilyn corrected him sharply. 15 years since she came crawling back with a baby in her arms. We took her in. We helped raise that child. We provided a roof and security. And what have we received in return? Silence. Secrecy. She locks herself in that room all day, typing away on that computer, claiming to have a job. But if you have a job, Reagan, where is the money? Why are we still paying the property tax? Why are we still handling the maintenance? She was rewriting history in real time, erasing every check I had written, every transfer I had made, every crisis I had solved. She was painting a portrait of a middle-aged parasite, and she was doing it with such conviction that I could see the doubt creeping into the eyes of my relatives. Uncle Derek was looking at me differently now, evaluating my clothes, my demeanor, wondering if I really was the failure Marilyn described. "So," Marilyn said, straightening her spine and clasping her hands on the table again, "we have made a decision. We are done enabling you." She paused for effect. This was the climax. This was the moment she had rehearsed in front of her vanity mirror. "Starting tomorrow," she announced, enunciating every syllable, "you are going to start paying fair market rent. We have looked at the comparables in the neighborhood. For a 4-bedroom colonial in our school district, with the amenities we provide, the going rate is upwards of $3,000 a month." She picked up her wine glass, took a sip, and set it down. "However, since you are family, we will be generous. Your rent is set at $2,900 a month. The first payment is due tomorrow morning. If you cannot pay it, or if you refuse to pay it, then you have 30 days to vacate the premises." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy and suffocating. A waiter approached with a pitcher of water, saw the expression on Marilyn's face, and immediately turned around and walked away. $2,900, I repeated calmly. "That is correct," Marilyn said, "and do not look at me like that. That is a steal in this economy. You should be thanking us for not charging you back rent for the last decade." Jenna made a choked, strangled gasp. She had been frozen until this moment, her fork hovering halfway to her mouth, her face drained of color. But the number seemed to snap her out of her shock. She dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against the china. "Grandma, you cannot be serious," Jenna said, her voice shaking. "Mom pays for all the groceries. She paid for the new roof last year. I saw the invoice. She paid for the HVAC repair, when the AC died in July. What are you talking about? Marilyn turned her cold gaze on her granddaughter. Do not interrupt adult conversations. Jenna, you do not know the details. Your mother likes to play make-believe. She likes to pretend she is contributing by buying a few bags of apples or calling a repairman. But the real costs, the mortgage, the insurance, the taxes, that is on us. That has always been on us. That is a lie. Jenna stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. Sit down. Jenna, I said. My voice was not loud, but it was steel. It cut through the hysteria rising in Jenna's throat. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes fixed on Marilyn. Mom, you can't let her. Jenna started, tears springing to her eyes. Sit down, I repeated, slower this time. Jenna looked at me, bewildered. She saw the set of my jaw. She saw the eerie calmness in my posture. She hesitated, looking between me and her grandmother, and then slowly sank back into her chair. She was trembling. Her hands were clenched into fists on her lap. She looked like her heart was breaking not because of the money, but because the illusion of family had just been shattered on the most important night of her life. I looked at my relatives. Aunt Cara was staring at her napkin, looking like she wanted to melt into the floorboards. Cousin Mike was checking his watch, clearly calculating how quickly he could escape once the check was paid. They were paralyzed by the social horror of it in the South. You do not talk about money at the dinner table, and you certainly do not evict your daughter over prime rib. But Marilyn had broken the social contract, and in doing so, she had paralyzed them all. Howard, I said, shifting my gaze to my father, is this your decision too? Howard flinched. He took a long drink of his scotch. It is only fair, Reagan, he muttered, refusing to meet my eyes. We are on a fixed income. We need to think about our retirement. You are capable, I echoed. That is an interesting word choice, Marilyn scoffed. Do not try to guilt-trip him. He has supported you long enough. We both have. We have carried you, Reagan. We have carried your baggage, your mistakes, and your child. We have denied ourselves things so that you could have a safe place to hide from the world. But that ends tonight. Tonight, you become a tenant, or you become homeless. Those are the options. She picked up her menu again, as if the conversation was concluded. Now, who is ready for dessert? I believe the key lime pie here is exceptional. The cruelty of the transition was breathtaking. She had just threatened to throw her only child onto the street, and in the same breath, she was ordering pie. It was a power move designed to show everyone that I was so insignificant, so beneath concern, that my eviction was merely a housekeeping item on the meeting agenda. Somewhere between the appetizers and the coffee, I looked at Jenna. She was staring at me, her eyes wide and pleading. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to flip the table. She wanted me to list every dollar I had ever spent, every sacrifice I had ever made. She wanted her mother to defend herself. I gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of my head. Not yet. My eyes said, wait. I turned back to Marilyn. She was smiling at the waiter who had tentatively returned, pointing at the dessert menu with a manicured finger. I will take the key lime, she said brightly, and brings forks for the table. We will share. I reached down and touched the leather portfolio again. The cool, smooth surface felt grounding. You are right, Mother, I said. Marilyn froze. The waiter paused. Excuse me, she asked, turning back to me, expecting a fight, expecting tears, expecting begging. I said you are right, I repeated, keeping my voice conversational, as if discussing the weather. It is time we stopped pretending. It is time we addressed the financial reality of our living situation. $2,900 seems like a very specific number. You have clearly done your research. Marilyn blinked. This was not the script. I was supposed to cry. I was supposed to say I couldn't afford it. I was supposed to ask for more time. I am glad you agree, she said, narrowing her eyes, suspicious of my compliance. Oh, I agree completely, I said. Fairness is paramount. And if we are going to operate on market principles, then we should absolutely follow the letter of the law. I smiled. It was the smile of a person who watches a thief try to sell a stolen watch to the police officer who owns it. Howard looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He knew me better than Marilyn did. In some ways, he knew that I did not roll over. He knew that my silence was usually a sign of calculation, not submission. Reagan. He started, a warning tone in his voice. No, Howard. Marilyn interrupted. She is accepting it. Finally, it is about time she grew up. She turned to the rest of the table. See, it just takes a little tough love. Sometimes you have to push the bird out of the nest. She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. I looked at Jenna again. She had stopped crying. She was watching me, and she saw the change in my posture. She saw me square my shoulders. She saw me push my plate slightly away to clear a space on the table. A realization dawned on her face. She took a deep breath and sat back, wiping her eyes. She knew that look. It was the look I had when I negotiated with insurance companies. It was the look I had when I dealt with contractors. It was the look of someone who was about to close a deal. I reached down and lifted the leather portfolio onto the table. It landed with a heavy, substantial thud that seemed to echo in the silence. "What is that?" Marilyn asked, her eyes darting to the worn leather. "Just some paperwork," I said efficiently. "Since we are discussing business, I thought we should have all the relevant documents on the table." Literally. I unzipped the portfolio. The sound of the zipper opening was loud, like a tear in the fabric of the room. I reached inside and pulled out the first file. It was a thick stack of papers, bound with a metal clip. "You mentioned rent," I said, smoothing the top page. "And you mentioned ownership. You said, 'This house does not run a charity.'" "That is right," Marilyn said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Good," I said, "because I have been feeling the same way for a long time." I opened the file. The papers were crisp, legal documents. I turned the folder around and slid it across the white tablecloth, past the untouched bread basket, past the wine glasses, until it rested directly in front of Uncle Derek. "Derek," I said, "you were in real estate for 30 years before you retired, right?" Derek jumped, startled to be dragged into the center of the arena. Yes, I was. Would you mind taking a look at that for me?" I asked. "I just want to make sure I'm reading it correctly. My legalese is a little rusty, but I believe that is a standard North Carolina general warranty deed." Derek looked at Marilyn, then at me. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the folder. "Go ahead." "Derek," Marilyn snapped, though her face had gone slightly pale. "Let us see what nonsense she has printed out. Probably some lease agreement she drafted herself." Derek put on his reading glasses. He opened the folder. He read the first line. He blinked. He read it again. Then he looked up, his mouth slightly open. He looked at me, then he looked at Marilyn, and his expression changed from confusion to absolute shock. "Well," Marilyn demanded, "what is it?" Derek cleared his throat. He sounded like he was strangling. "Marilyn," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is a deed. I know what a deed is," she hissed. "Who is on it?" Derek looked at the paper again, as if hoping the words would change. "It says here," he stammered, "it says the grantee that is the owner is Reagan Elizabeth Miles." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. It sucked the oxygen out of the room. Marilyn stared at him, her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish that had been pulled onto the dock, gasping for air. What she whispered finally, and the date I asked politely, taking a sip of my water. Derek swallowed hard. "The date of recording is October 14th, 2011, 15 years ago," I said. Howard dropped his phone. It hit the table with a crack, skidded across the cloth, and fell onto the floor. He didn't move to pick it up. He just sat there, frozen, his face turning the color of ash. Marilyn snatched the paper from Derek's hands. She ripped it close to her face, her eyes scanning the lines frantically. Her hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled like a dry leaf in a gale. "This is fake," she spat, throwing the paper back onto the table. "It is a forgery. She typed this up on her computer. This is ridiculous. Howard, tell them it is our house." Howard did not speak. He was looking at the tablecloth, unable to lift his head. I reached into the portfolio again. "I assumed you would say that." I said, "So here is the property tax history for the last 15 years. Paid by check. Drawn from the account of Reagan Miles." I slid another stack of papers across the table. "And here is the homeowner's insurance policy, listing Reagan Miles as the primary policyholder and beneficiary." Another slide. "And here," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "is the bank statement showing the payoff of the original mortgage, the one you and Howard were about to default on before I stepped in." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, clasping my hands together just as she had done minutes ago. "So, Mother," I said softly, "if you are demanding rent from the person living in this house, I believe you are sitting in the wrong chair, because according to the state of North Carolina, you are not the landlord, you are the tenant, and I am the one who has been letting you live rent-free. To understand why a piece of paper sitting on a white tablecloth could suck the oxygen out of a room, you have to understand the machinery of the Vasquez-Miles family. It is a mechanism as complex and archaic as a grandfather clock, and for 40 years, I have been the one cog that kept it turning by absorbing the friction." As the silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, spanning the distance between my mother's horrified face and the deed lying in front of Uncle Derek, I felt a strange, detached sense of clarity. It was the kind of clarity I used in my professional life when dissecting a failed data model. I looked at them, Marilyn and Howard, not as my parents, but as components in a system that had just suffered a catastrophic failure. I call it the family machine. It runs on a very specific fuel mixture. Marilyn provides the combustion, the high-octane drama, the public humiliation, the constant manufacturing of crises where she can swoop in as the long-suffering martyr. She needs to be the victim and the savior simultaneously. To maintain that equilibrium, she requires a villain. She requires a deadweight. For 15 years, that role had been assigned to me. I was the cautionary tale she told her friends over brunch. I was the cross she had to bear. And Howard, my father, is the grease. He is the lubricant of silence that allows the gears to grind over me without seizing up. His passivity is not a lack of action. It is a choice. Every time he looked at his phone instead of his wife's cruelty, every time he mumbled "fair is fair" while knowing it was a lie, he was maintaining the machine's efficiency. He knew the truth was dangerous. The truth would require him to stand up, to speak out, to be a man rather than a shadow. And Howard loved the shadows. I watched Marilyn's chest heave as she stared at the document. She was trying to reboot the system. She was trying to find a way to spin this, to process this new data point that Reagan the failures, the leech, the burden was actually the one holding the keys. My mind drifted back, away from the restaurant, to the hundreds of quiet mornings in that house. They always saw what they wanted to see. That is the thing about a narrative. Once it is written, you stop looking at the reality that contradicts it. When Jenna was 5 years old, sitting on the living room rug with her coloring books, I would be at the dining room table with my laptop open, to Marilyn, walking past with her laundry basket. I was playing on the computer. I was wasting time. She never asked what I was doing. If she had, I might have told her that I was running complex predictive models for Harbor Lane Analytics Group. I might have mentioned that I was a senior data lead, managing a team of 12 analysts distributed across 3 time zones. I might have told her that the little typing job she mocked to her bridge club was actually a 6-figure career that I had built from the ground up, fighting for every promotion while balancing a baby on my hip. I remembered one specific Tuesday, about 8 years ago. I had just closed a massive contract renewal for the firm, a deal that came with a bonus of $15,000. I was feeling good. I was feeling proud. I walked into the kitchen to make a cup of coffee, and Marilyn was there, scrubbing the counter with aggressive, angry motions. "Must be nice," she had muttered, not looking at me. "What must be nice?" I asked. "To sit around all day, to have no real responsibilities. Your father is out there breaking his back at the dealership, and you are clicking buttons." I had paused, the coffee mug warm in my hand. I wanted to scream. I wanted to show her my bank balance. I wanted to tell her that the dealership Howard managed had been in the red for 3 years, and that the only reason they hadn't missed a mortgage payment was because I quietly transferred $2,000 into their joint account every month under the label household contribution. But I didn't. I just drank my coffee. Why? Because the machine needed me to be the failure, if I was successful, if I was wealthy, if I was capable. Then who was Marilyn? She would just be a mean, controlling old woman living in her daughter's house. The narrative of Saint Marilyn supporting her loser daughter was the only thing holding her ego together. It was the armor she wore to protect herself from her own irrelevance, and I, in my infinite, stupid guilt, had allowed her to keep it. I had let her wear that armor because I thought it was the price of peace. I thought if I played the role, Jenna would be safe. I looked at Jenna now. She was sitting to my left, her hands still covering her mouth, her eyes darting between me and the paper on the table. She looked terrified, not because of the conflict, but because her entire understanding of the world was shifting. She had grown up believing the story too. She loved me, she defended me, but deep down, she believed I was the struggling single mom who needed Grandma's help. I saw the confusion in her eyes, and then I saw the realization. She was replaying her own memories. She was remembering the times I bought her the expensive cleats for soccer without asking Howard. She was remembering the brand new laptop I got her for college. She was remembering how I never, ever said, "We can't afford it." I realized then that I had made a mistake. I had protected my parents' ego at the expense of my own dignity, and by extension, my daughter's respect. I had let her watch me be treated like a doormat for 15 years. No more. The machine stops tonight. I looked back at Marilyn. She was still staring at the deed, her face a mask of furious denial. She looked up at me, and I saw the gears turning. She was about to pivot. She was about to say it was a trick, a clerical error, a manipulation. She was about to launch the counterattack. "You think you are so smart," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You think printing out some paper changes who you are? You are still the girl who got pregnant at 21. You are still the girl who came running home. And you are still the woman who needed that girl's money to keep a roof over her head," I thought. But I didn't say it yet. I looked around the table. The audience was captive. Uncle Derek was rereading the deed, his lips moving silently. Aunt Kara was staring at me as if I had just grown a second head. Cousin Mike had actually put his phone down. I felt a profound sense of calm settle over me. It was the calm of a demolition expert who has set the charges and is now just holding the detonator. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to cry. The facts were my explosives. I reached out and picked up my water glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The condensation was cold against my fingertips. I set the glass back down on the tablecloth. The sound, a soft, muted thud, seemed to signal the end of the intermission. "You're right, Mom," I said again, breaking the silence I had allowed to stretch. My voice was conversational, almost pleasant. It was the tone I used when explaining to a junior analyst why their data set was corrupted. Marilyn blinked, thrown off balance by my agreement. "Right about what?" she snapped. "About the need for a conversation about finances," I said. "And about the house. You said, quite clearly, that this house does not run a charity. You said that adults pay their own way. You said that the free ride is over." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. I could not agree more. For 15 years, I have allowed the boundaries of this family to be fluid. I did it because I wanted Jenna to have a grandfather and a grandmother. I did it because I thought that eventually, if I gave enough, if I paid enough, if I swallowed enough pride, you would eventually love me for who I am. Not for who you need me to be. Marilyn scoffed. A sharp, ugly sound. Love you, we fed you, we clothed you. No, I corrected her gently. I fed myself, I clothed myself, and for the last decade and a half, I have fed and clothed you too. Liar, she shrieked. It was a desperate sound. The sound of a metal gear stripping its teeth. I didn't flinch. I just reached out and pulled the leather portfolio closer to me. It slid across the tablecloth with a whisper of friction. The truth doesn't care if you believe it, Mother, I said. That is the beautiful thing about data. It just is. I placed my hand on the next tab in the portfolio. It was red. You mentioned Harbor Lane Analytics Group earlier. I lied. She hadn't mentioned it. She had ignored it. Or rather, you ignored it. You assumed that because I work from home, I do not work, but Harbor Lane pays its senior lead analysts very well. My base salary last year was $112,000. My performance bonuses added another $28,000. A gasp went around the table. Aunt Kara's eyes widened. $140,000. In North Carolina? That was not just getting by money, that was doing very well money. I don't believe you, Marilyn said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was looking at my clothes now, the simple black dress, the lack of jewelry, and seeing them not as signs of poverty, but of choice. You don't have to, I said. The IRS believes me, the bank believes me. I flipped the red tab. But we are not here to talk about my income. We are here to talk about your expenses. You asked for rent? You demanded $2,900 a month, a fair market rate. You said, I looked at Howard. Dad, do you remember the conversation we had in the kitchen back in 2011, the night the bank sent the foreclosure notice? Howard looked up. His face was gray. Reagan, don't, he whispered. Not here. Not now. This is exactly the time, I said, echoing Marilyn's earlier words. The machine is broken. Dad, we are fixing it. I turned back to the room. They were 3 months behind on the mortgage. The dealership was failing. They had maxed out 4 credit cards trying to keep up appearances. They were going to lose the house. They were going to lose everything. Stop it, Marilyn shouted. She started to stand up. This is private family business. You made it public business when you tried to evict me in front of Cousin Mike, I said, my voice cutting like a whip. Sit down. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and to everyone's shock, including her own, Marilyn sat. I had the money, I continued, speaking to the room. I had an inheritance from Grandma Evelyn, your mother, Marilyn, that you didn't know about, and I had my savings. I offered to pay off the arrears. I offered to take over the payments. I tapped the portfolio. But I am a data analyst. I deal in risk. And I knew that paying your debts without securing my asset was a bad investment. So we made a deal. I paid off the mortgage. I paid off the credit cards. And in exchange, you signed the deed over to me. You got to keep your house. You got to keep your reputation. You got to pretend you were still the lords of the manor. I looked at Marilyn, whose eyes were wet with tears of rage. All I asked for was peace, and you couldn't even give me that. You took my money, you took my house, and you spent 15 years calling me a failure in the home that I own. I opened the folder to the next section. So, let's look at the ledger, I said. If we are talking about who owes who, I felt Jenna's hand touch my arm. It was a light touch. Shaking slightly, I looked at her. She wasn't asking me to stop. She was looking at me with a new expression. It was awe. Keep going, Mom, she whispered, and with my daughter's permission. I prepared to show them exactly what the cost of their pride had been. I unzipped the leather portfolio all the way around. The sound was a long, jagged tear in the fabric of the silence that had befallen the room. I folded the cover back, revealing the interior. It was not a chaotic mess of loose papers. It was a precise, curated archive. The documents were organized by category, separated by color-coded Mylar tabs, blue for ownership, green for taxes, yellow for maintenance, and read for the final correspondence I hoped I would not have to use. "If we are going to make this public," I said, my voice steady and carrying to the far ends of the long table, "then let us do it right. We are not going to rely on memory. We are not going to rely on stories. We are going to rely on the written record." I pulled the first stack of papers from behind the blue tab. The paper was heavy, legal weight bond, the kind that feels substantial between your fingers. "Let us discuss the asset in question," I continued. "The property located at 1128 Hawthorne Ridge Drive, a 2-story colonial, brick facade, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, sitting on 0.4 acres of land. That is the house you are referring to, correct? The one you claim I am renting from you." Marilyn glared at me. Her face was flushed, her makeup settling into the lines around her mouth as her expression twisted into a sneer. "You know exactly what house it is. Reagan," she snapped, "it is the house your father and I bought in 1985. It is the house where we raised you. It is the house where my name is on the mailbox." Howard nodded next to her. It was a rhythmic, automatic motion, like a bobblehead doll on a dashboard. "That is right," he mumbled, looking at the centerpiece of white lilies rather than at me. "It is our home. We have lived there for 40 years. Possession and ownership are two very different legal concepts." "Father," I said, "you have lived there, yes. You have slept there. You have eaten there. But that does not mean you own the walls around you." I slid the top document across the tablecloth. It moved smoothly over the starched white fabric, coming to rest directly in front of Uncle Derek. Derek sat at the midpoint of the table. He was the perfect arbiter for this moment. Before he retired to play golf and complain about politics, Derek had spent 35 years as a residential real estate broker in Wake County. He knew contracts. He knew the weight of a county seal. He knew that unlike a family argument, a property deed did not care about your feelings. "Derek," I said, gesturing to the document, "I know it has been a few years since you closed a deal, but I assume you still know what a North Carolina general warranty deed looks like." Derek looked nervous. He adjusted his glasses, the wire frames catching the light from the chandelier above. He looked at Marilyn, then at me. Sensing that he was being pulled into the crossfire, "I know what a deed looks like, Reagan," he said cautiously. "Please read the document in front of you." I requested, specifically, the date recorded at the top right, the description of the grantor and the grantee, and the official book and page number from the County Register of Deeds. Marilyn reached out as if to snatch the paper away. But Derek was faster. His professional curiosity had been piqued. He picked up the document, holding it under the light. The table leaned in. Aunt Cara stopped chewing. Cousin Mike craned his neck. Even the waitstaff, hovering by the sideboard, seemed to be listening. Derek squinted at the text. He read in silence for a moment, his lips moving slightly. Then his eyebrows shot up. He pulled the paper closer, as if checking for a defect. "Well," Marilyn demanded, her voice high and tight, "tell her it is nonsense. Derek, tell her it is just some piece of paper she typed up to confuse everyone." Derek cleared his throat. He looked up, and his face had lost all its color. He looked at Howard, and there was a mixture of pity and confusion in his expression. "Marilyn," he said, his voice dropping to a hush, "this looks real." "It is not real," she hissed. "It has the seal," Derek said, pointing to the bottom of the page. "It has the electronic stamp from the Wake County Register of Deeds. It lists the recording time. 11:42 a.m., October 14th, 2011. Read the names." "Derek," I commanded softly. Derek swallowed hard. "The grantors are Howard Vasquez and Marilyn Vasquez, husband and wife," he read. "The grantee, the person receiving the property, is Reagan Elizabeth Miles." He looked up at me. "It says here the transfer was made for the sum of $10 and other good and valuable consideration." He added, "That is the standard language for a family transfer or a gift, but the title is fee simple. It is a full transfer." He set the paper down as if it were radioactive. "According to this, Reagan owns the house. She has owned it for 15 years. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the sudden, crushing weight of a paradigm shift. Every person at that table had spent a decade and a half believing one story. They had believed I was the charity case. They had believed I was the boomerang child who refused to launch. Now, in the span of 30 seconds, the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Marilyn let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. It sounded like glass breaking. "Give me that," she shrieked. She snatched the paper from the table, crumpling the edge in her violence. She held it up to her face, her eyes scanning the lines frantically. She wasn't reading it. She was looking for the flaw. She was looking for the misspelling, the wrong font, the telltale sign of a forgery. "This is fake," she declared, throwing the paper back down. "It is a forgery. You can do anything with Photoshop these days. You think you can fool us with a piece of paper you printed at Kinko's? I expected that," I said calmly. I reached back into the portfolio and pulled out the green-tabbed section. "A deed is a one-time event," I explained to the room, adopting the tone of a patient professor. "But ownership is an ongoing responsibility. Ownership leaves a trail." I fanned out 3 sheets of paper and slid them toward Derek, bypassing Marilyn completely. "If the deed is a fake, Mother, then I suppose the Wake County Tax Department is also in on the conspiracy." I pointed to the papers. "These are the annual property tax assessments for the last 3 years. Notice the name on the billing address. It does not say Howard and Marilyn Vasquez. It says Reagan Miles. And notice the payment status. Paid in full. By check number 402, 459, and 511. I looked at Aunt Kara. "Kara, you know how strict the county is. If the taxes aren't paid, they put a lien on the house, if the house was really theirs. And I was just a squatter. Why have the tax bills been coming to me? And why have I been paying them?" Kara looked at Marilyn, her eyes wide. "Marilyn," Kara asked softly, "is this true?" Marilyn did not answer. She was staring at the tax bills, her breathing shallow and rapid. "And this," I said, pulling a stack of yellow-tabbed papers. "This is the homeowner's insurance declaration page from State Farm." I slid it across. "Look at the named insured, Reagan Miles. Look at the coverage amount. Rebuilding cost estimated at $450,000. If this house burned down tomorrow, the check would not go to Howard and Marilyn. It would go to me. Because I am the one with the insurable interest. I am the one paying the premiums." I turned to Howard. He was shrinking in his chair, trying to make himself as small as possible. "Dad, do you remember when the roof leaked in 2019? The big storm?" He didn't answer. "We needed a complete tear-off and replacement," I said, answering for him. "It cost $12,400. Marilyn told the family that you dipped into your retirement savings to cover it. She told everyone what a sacrifice it was." I pulled a single, stapled document from the yellow section. It was an invoice from Triangle Roofing, with a copy of a cashed check attached to the front. "Here is the contract, signed by Reagan Miles, and here is the check, signed by Reagan Miles, drawn on the account of Reagan Miles." I looked around the table. The food was getting cold. The wine was sitting untouched. The reality of the situation was settling in like a dense fog. "You see," I said, folding my hands on top of the portfolio, "this isn't just about a piece of paper. It is about the money. For 15 years, I have paid the taxes, I have paid the insurance, I have paid for the repairs, I have paid the HOA fees." I turned my gaze back to Marilyn. She looked cornered. She looked dangerous. But she also looked small. The grand matriarch who controlled the family narrative was dissolving, replaced by a bitter woman caught in a lie. "So, Mother," I said, delivering the line I had practiced in the shower, in the car, and in my dreams for over a decade. "If you are going to sit there and call this your house, and if you are going to demand $2,900 a month in rent, then you have made a critical error in your calculations, because you are attempting to collect rent from the landlord." The table erupted. It wasn't a cheer. It was a chaotic murmur of shock and confusion. Cousin Mike whispered a curse word under his breath. Aunt Kara put her hand over her mouth. Jenna, sitting beside me, let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for an hour. She looked at me with a mixture of pride and disbelief, finally understanding the scope of the protection I had built around us. But Marilyn was not done. I could see it in her eyes. Denial is a powerful drug, and she had been overdosing on it for years. She wasn't going to surrender just because the evidence was insurmountable. She was going to fight. She was going to try to turn the table back over, to make this about emotion, about loyalty, about anything other than the cold, hard facts lying on the white tablecloth. She stood up again, her chair screeching against the floor. "You ungrateful wretch," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. The restaurant went silent. People at other tables turned to look. But I didn't care. I didn't look away. I had one hand resting on the red tab in my portfolio. I hadn't even played my best card yet. "Sit down, Marilyn," Uncle Derek said, his voice surprisingly firm. "The evidence is right here." "I don't care about the papers," Marilyn yelled. "She tricked us. She took advantage of us when we were vulnerable." I watched her unravel. It was ugly, and it was sad. But it was also necessary. The wound had to be opened before it could be cleaned. I waited for her to take a breath, and then I prepared to deliver the history lesson that would explain exactly how we ended up here. I was going to remind them of the year 2011, of the bankruptcy that almost happened, and of the daughter who saved them only to be punished for it. But first, I let the silence stretch 1 second longer, letting the word landlord hang in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. The chaos at the table had settled into a low, vibrating hum, the kind of sound you hear standing near a high-tension power line. Marilyn was still standing, her chest heaving, her finger pointed at me like a loaded weapon, but the ammunition was gone. The paper lying in front of Uncle Derek had stripped the magazine. I did not shout back. I did not match her hysteria. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs, and looked at my mother with a gaze that went straight through her anger and landed squarely on her shame. "Let us take a trip down memory lane," I said, my voice cutting through the murmur of the room. "Let us go back to the year 2011. Do you remember that year, Mother? Or have you rewritten that chapter too?" Marilyn's mouth clamped shut. She knew exactly what year it was. I turned to the rest of the family. They were staring at me, captive audience members in a play they hadn't realized was a tragedy. 15 years ago, the narrative was very different. I began. "You all remember the recession. You remember how the economy bottomed out. But what you do not know is what was happening inside that big, beautiful house on Hawthorne Ridge Drive." I looked at Howard. He was staring at his hands, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. In the winter of 2011, the dealership was hemorrhaging money. Howard had leveraged the house to cover the business losses. He had taken out a second mortgage, and then a line of credit. And then, the balloon payment came due. I paused, letting the financial terminology sink in. They were 3 months away from foreclosure, I stated flatly. The bank had sent the notice of default. It was not a warning anymore. It was an eviction countdown. Marilyn made a sound, a sharp intake of breath. But she did not interrupt. She couldn't. The truth was a physical weight in the room. "I was living in the guest room then," I continued. "I had moved back in after my divorce, bringing Jenna with me. I was working remotely, saving every penny, trying to rebuild my life. I thought I was just a guest, until the night I walked into the kitchen and found my mother on the floor. I looked at Marilyn. You were not standing tall then, were you? I asked softly. You were not commanding the room. You were on your knees on the linoleum, sobbing into a dish towel because the sheriff had just served the papers. I turned back to Aunt Kara, who looked horrified. She begged me. I said, she did not ask. She begged. She grabbed my ankles. She told me they were going to lose everything, the house, the cars, the status. She said they would be the laughingstock of the country club. She said she would rather die than have the neighbors see a moving truck backed up to the driveway by the bank. I took a sip of water. The memory was crisp, high definition. I had just received the probate settlement from Grandma Evelyn. I said, a ripple went through the table. Grandma Evelyn, Marilyn's mother, had been a woman of quiet wealth and steel ambition. You all thought Evelyn left everything to Marilyn. I said, but Grandma knew better. She knew Marilyn spent money like water, so she bypassed her daughter and left the bulk of her liquid assets to me. It was not a fortune. It was $235,000. $235,000, Cousin Mike repeated, a low whistle escaping his lips. It was enough to start a new life. I said, it was enough to buy a condo for me and Jenna. It was enough to invest. It was my freedom money. I looked at Jenna. She was watching me with wide eyes, learning for the first time that her stability had not been a gift from her grandparents, but a sacrifice from her mother. Marilyn asked for it. I said, she asked me to give her the money to save the house. She promised it would be a loan. She promised they would pay me back with interest once the market turned around. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. But there was a condition, wasn't there? Mother Marilyn looked away, her face a mask of bitter resentment. She grabbed my hands. I told the room, and she said, Reagan, nobody can know. You cannot tell your aunts. You cannot tell your cousins. It is humiliating. If people know we borrowed money from our daughter, we will never live it down. You have to let us say we are supporting you. You have to let us say we are helping you get back on your feet. I let that sink in. That was the deal. I said, I give them nearly $250,000 to save their reputation, and in exchange, I agree to be the family failure. I agree to play the role of the struggling single mom, so that Marilyn Vasquez can keep playing the role of the benevolent matriarch. I shook my head. I did it for Jenna. I said, my voice softening, I didn't want my daughter to lose her home. I didn't want her to see her grandparents broken. So I wrote the check, $210,000, to clear the arrears and pay down the principal to a manageable level. I tapped the leather portfolio. But I am not my mother, I said sharply. I do not operate on wishes and prayers. I operate on contracts. I gestured to Derek. Derek, look at the addendum on the second page of that deed. Derek flipped the page. His hands were shaking slightly. It is a transfer agreement, he murmured. Correct, I said. When they stopped paying me back, which happened exactly 4 months after I wrote the check, I gave them a choice. I told them I was not going to throw good money after bad. I told them that if they could not repay the loan, they had to transfer the asset. I looked at Howard. Do you remember that night in the study? Dad? You were crying. You said you had failed us. You said you didn't deserve to keep the house. And I told you that you didn't have to leave. I told you that as long as I owned the house, you would always have a roof over your head. All you had to do was sign the deed. He signed it, I said to the room, and Marilyn signed it. They signed over the house to settle the debt. It was a business transaction. I bought the house for the price of their debt, and the agreement was simple. I pay the taxes. I pay the insurance. I handle the maintenance. They get to live there for free. They get to keep their dignity. They get to pretend it is still their house. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a fierce whisper. I did not live off you, Mother. I did not mooch. I bought your safety. I bought your pride. And I bought the stability that allowed Jenna to grow up in the only home she has ever known without worrying about a foreclosure sign on the front lawn. I turned to Derek again. Is it legal? Derek, I asked. Derek looked up. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. It is notarized, he said, his voice flat. It is recorded. The stamp is from the county clerk. It references the payoff of the previous lien. It is ironclad. This property belongs to Reagan Miles. He looked at Marilyn. You sold the house to her. Marilyn, 15 years ago. Marilyn was trembling. The truth had stripped her naked in front of the people whose admiration she craved most. The facade she had polished for 15 years, the image of the wealthy. Generous grandmother supporting her deadbeat daughter had been shattered by a few sheets of paper, but she was a fighter. I had to give her that. When cornered, a rat will bite. And my mother was about to go for the jugular. She slammed her hand down on the table. The silverware jumped. "So that is it," she spat. Her face twisted into a snarl. "You kept the receipts. You kept a file." She looked around the room, seeking allies. Her eyes wild. "Look at her," she screamed, pointing at me. "Look at how cold she is. Who does this? Who keeps a record of every penny they give to their own parents?" She turned back to me, her voice dripping with venom. "We raised you, we changed your diapers, we paid for your braces, and you calculated it. You sat there in your room, typing on your computer, keeping a ledger against your own mother and father." She let out a sob, but it sounded forced, a weaponized display of emotion. "You are a monster. Reagan," she cried, "you are calculating and cold. You watched us struggle. You watched us try to maintain our dignity, and you just bought us like we were a hostile takeover." She looked at Jenna. "Jenna, honey, look at your mother. Look at what she is. She cares more about money than she does about family. She let us believe this was our home, and all the while she was just waiting. She was waiting for the moment to humiliate us." I watched her performance with a detachment that surprised even me. Years ago, this would have crushed me. I would have apologized. I would have shredded the papers just to make her stop crying. But I looked at the deed lying on the table. And I looked at the daughter sitting next to me, the daughter who had just graduated with honors because I had provided a stable foundation, and I felt nothing but a cold, hard resolve. "I am not calculating." "Mother," I said calmly, "I am prepared." "You are heartless," she screamed. "You think this piece of paper makes you the boss. You think because you have a job and a bank account that you are better than us. You are still nothing. You are still the girl who couldn't make her own marriage work, the low blow, the reference to my divorce. It was her favorite weapon, a rusty knife she liked to twist whenever she felt she was losing ground." I stood up. It was a slow, deliberate movement. I didn't knock over my chair. I didn't slam the table. I just rose, unfolding myself until I was looking down at her. "I am the woman who saved you," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. "And I am the woman who has kept your secret for 15 years. I swallowed every insult. I took every passive-aggressive comment. I let you tell everyone at this table that I was a burden. I let you shame me. I let you treat me like a servant in my own house. I picked up the deed from in front of Derek and held it up. I did all of that because I thought that somewhere, buried deep under all that vanity, you actually loved us. I thought that if I saved you, you would be grateful." I dropped the paper back onto the table. "But I was wrong. You didn't want a savior. Marilyn, you wanted a punching bag. And you are angry now not because I own the house, but because the punching bag just hit back." Marilyn stared at me, her chest heaving. She opened her mouth to speak, to launch another tirade, to rewrite history again, but I wasn't done. "You called me calculating," I asked. "You asked if I kept score." I reached into the portfolio and pulled out the next section. The tabs were yellow. "If you think owning the house is the only thing I have on you," I said, "then you really haven't been paying attention to what I do for a living." I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It wasn't a deed. It was a spreadsheet, a simple, printed spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and descriptions. "You mentioned fairness earlier," I said. "You mentioned that adults pay their own way. So let us look at the operational costs of the Vasquez lifestyle over the last decade." I pointed to the first column. "Here is the cost of the country club membership you refused to cancel, even when you couldn't buy groceries. $450 a month. Paid by Reagan Miles." I pointed to the second column. "Here is the lease payment on the Lexus you insisted on driving because appearances matter. $580 a month. Paid by Reagan Miles." I looked at the family. "She calls me calculating because I kept track." I said, "But if I hadn't kept track, if I hadn't managed the cash flow, the repo man would have taken that Lexus 5 years ago." Marilyn's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. She looked like she was choking on her own bile. "Stop it," she screeched. "You are embarrassing the family." "No, Mother," I said coldly. You embarrassed the family when you tried to extort rent from your daughter at her own child's graduation dinner. I am just balancing the books. I sat back down, the adrenaline humming in my veins. The room was deathly silent. No one was eating. No one was drinking. They were watching a demolition. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the building being destroyed. I was the wrecking ball. And the best part, I thought, feeling the smooth leather of the portfolio under my fingertips, I haven't even fired the eviction notice yet. Marilyn looked around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped animal seeking an exit. She had lost the factual argument, the deed, the tax records, the insurance policies. They formed a wall she could not breach. So, she did what she always did when logic failed her. She appealed to the emotional court of the family. Counting on the deep-seated Southern tradition of enabling dysfunction for the sake of appearances, she turned to her sister. My Aunt Cara. Cara was a woman who hated conflict so much she would likely apologize to a burglar for not having better silver. Marilyn reached out and grabbed Cara's hand, clutching it with a desperation that turned her knuckles white. Cara, she pleaded, her voice trembling with a manufactured fragility. You understand, do you not? You understand what we have been through. Family helps family. That is the rule. We took Reagan in when she had nothing. We gave her a safe harbor. And now? Now she throws legal papers in our faces. Is this how we treat our own blood? Cara looked miserable. She looked from Marilyn's tear-stained face to my stoic expression, and then down at the damning pile of documents in front of her husband, Derek. She shifted in her seat, the silk of her dress rustling in the quiet room. Well, Marilyn, Cara started, her voice wavering. I mean, yes, family should help each other. We all know that. And if Reagan helped you out, that is good. But nothing. Marilyn interrupted, sensing a crack she could wedge herself into. She twisted my arm. Cara, she took advantage of us when we were desperate. We were drowning. And she threw us an anchor attached to a chain. She looked around the table, her gaze sweeping over the cousins and in-laws. She wants you to think she is the victim. Marilyn cried, pressing a napkin to her dry eyes. But look at how she planned this. She brought a portfolio to a graduation dinner. Who does that? Only someone cold. Only someone calculating. It was a good performance. I could see the hesitation in Cousin Mike's eyes. I could see the discomfort in Aunt Linda's face. Marilyn was masterful at playing the ungrateful child card. It was a tune they all knew the lyrics to. But then, a voice cut through the theatrics. It was not my voice. So, let me get this straight. It was Jenna. My daughter had been silent for most of the meal, paralyzed by the shock of the revelation, but the shock had worn off, replaced by a dawning, burning realization. She was sitting up straight now, her hands flat on the table, the sash that read "Honors" slipping slightly off her shoulder. She was not looking at me. She was looking directly at her grandmother. Jenna. Marilyn said, blinking, "Honey, this does not concern—" "It concerns me," Jenna interrupted. Her voice was not loud, but it had a clarity that silenced the room instantly. "It concerns me because I have lived in that house my entire life." She picked up her water glass, her hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from anger. She took a sip and set it down hard. "You said Mom was a leech," Jenna said. "You said it tonight. You said, 'We do not run a charity.' You said she was living off you." Marilyn stiffened. "Well, in a manner of speaking, we provided no," Jenna said, cutting her off again. "Not in a manner of speaking. You said it literally. You have said it for years." Jenna looked around the table, making eye contact with every single relative. Every Thanksgiving. She said, every Christmas, every Easter. "I would hear you in the kitchen. Grandma, I would hear you talking to Aunt Cara or Cousin Mike. You would say, 'Poor Reagan, she just cannot get it together.' You would say, 'It is so hard supporting a grown woman, but we do it for Jenna.'" Jenna's voice broke, but she swallowed and pushed through. "I grew up thinking my mother was a burden," Jenna whispered. I grew up feeling guilty that we were eating your food. I used to be afraid to ask for new shoes because I thought I was taking money out of your retirement." She turned back to Marilyn, and the look in her eyes was devastating. "But she bought the house. Grandma, she paid the mortgage. She paid the taxes. She paid for the car you drive." Jenna leaned forward. "So, why did you lie? Why did you spend 15 years telling everyone my mom was a failure when she was the one keeping a roof over your head?" The question hung in the air like smoke. It was the question that stripped away the last layer of Marilyn's defense. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about character. The silence that followed was excruciating. No one wanted to answer, but the truth, once summoned, demands a witness. Cousin Mike, sitting at the far end of the table, cleared his throat. He looked at his plate, then at Marilyn. "She is right. Marilyn," Mike said quietly, "you did say that. Last 4th of July. You told me and Sarah that you were worried about money because you were practically supporting 2 households on 1 income. You said Reagan hadn't contributed a dime to the household expenses in a decade." Marilyn gasped, turning on him. "I never said you did." Aunt Linda chimed in. Her voice was soft but firm. "You told me the same thing when we went shopping for Jenna's prom dress. You said you had to pay for it because Reagan was broke." I looked at my mother. She was shrinking. The collective memory of the family was turning against her. The hundreds of little lies she had planted over the years were sprouting up all at once, creating a forest of deceit that she could no longer navigate. She turned desperately to Howard. "Howard," she hissed, "say something. Tell them." My father looked up. He looked older than I had ever seen him. The skin on his face seemed to hang loose, deflated by the pressure of the moment. He looked at Jenna, then at me. I thought he stammered. "What did you think? Dad?" I asked softly. "I thought it was better this way," he whispered. "Better," I asked. "Better to let your wife humiliate your daughter for 15 years. Better to let your granddaughter believe her mother was incompetent." Howard rubbed his face with his hands. "I just wanted peace." "Reagan," he said, his voice cracking. "Your mother, she needs to feel needed. She needs to feel important. When you paid off the house, it killed her inside. It made her feel small. So she told the story. And I just let her. It seemed harmless." "Harmless," Jenna repeated, her voice rising. "You threatened to kick us out tonight. You demanded rent from the owner. How is that harmless?" Howard looked down at his lap. "I didn't know she was going to do that tonight. I tried to tell her. You signed the deed." "Howard," Uncle Derek interjected. His voice was cold, professional. He was looking at the paperwork again. "I signed it," Howard admitted, "but I was confused." Marilyn shouted. Trying one last, desperate pivot, she slammed her hand on the table again. I was under duress. I was having a panic attack. I didn't know what I was signing. She tricked me. She put a bunch of papers in front of me and said, "Sign here," and I just did it because I was distraught. She looked at Derek, her eyes wide and pleading. "It is invalid. Derek, if I didn't understand what I was signing, it is invalid. That is the law." "Isn't it?" Derek looked at her over the rim of his glasses. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had just realized his sister-in-law was a sociopath. "Marilyn," Derek said slowly, "this deed was prepared by the law firm of Henderson and Associates." So she snapped. "So," Derek continued, pointing to the bottom of the page, "it was witnessed by 2 people, and it was notarized. And right here, attached to the back, is a certificate of voluntary transfer." He held up the page. "It is a separate affidavit, signed by you and Howard, stating that you are of sound mind, that you are under no duress, and that you understand you are relinquishing all rights to the property in exchange for debt forgiveness." He dropped the paper back onto the stack. "You didn't just sign a napkin. Marilyn, you sat in a lawyer's office for an hour. You knew exactly what you were doing. You were saving your own skin." Marilyn opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The legal reality had clamped her shut. I decided it was time to close the ledger. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out a calculator, a small, solar-powered one I used for quick estimates. I set it on the table. "Since we are accounting for things," I said, "let us look at the total investment." I picked up the summary sheet I had prepared. The initial payoff to save the house from foreclosure, $210,000. The property taxes over 15 years, averaging $4,000 a year, $60,000. The insurance premiums, $22,000. The maintenance, the roof, the HVAC, the water heater, the exterior painting, the landscaping, $45,000. The car payments for the vehicles you drove, $38,000. The cash allowances I transferred to your account to keep the lights on, roughly $150 a week for 15 years. I punched the numbers into the calculator. Though I already knew the sum by heart, I hit the equals button and turned the screen toward Marilyn. $492,000. I said. The number hung in the air. Nearly $500,000. That is what I have poured into the Vasquez family image, I said. That is the cost of your pride. That is the cost of my silence. I looked at the relatives, and in return I asked, did I get a thank you? Did I get a hug? Did I get a single moment of gratitude? I looked at Marilyn. No, I got a bill. I got an ultimatum. I got told to pay rent in a house I already bought twice over. Marilyn was shaking. She was vibrating with a rage so pure it was almost impressive. She had been stripped of her money, her house, and her narrative. She had nothing left but the biological fact of her existence. So that is it, she hissed, her voice low and guttural. You think money makes you a mother? You think writing checks makes you a daughter? She stood up, leaning over the table, her face contorted. I gave you life, she screamed. I carried you in my body for 9 months. I went through labor for you. I fed you from my own breast. You owe me everything. You hear me? Everything. She struck her chest with her fist. There is no price tag on being a mother. Reagan. You can pile up all the receipts you want, but you will never pay off the debt you owe me for your very existence. You are ungrateful. You are a cold, heartless bitch who counts pennies while stepping on the parents who made her. The restaurant was dead silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped moving. It was the ultimate trump card, the I gave you life card. It was the weapon she saved for when she had no ground left to stand on. I looked at her. I didn't feel the guilt she wanted me to feel. I didn't feel the shame. I felt light. I felt the weight of 43 years of obligation dissolving into the ether. I stood up slowly. I picked up my wine glass, the one I hadn't touched all night, and took a sip. I set it down. You are right, Mother. I said. She blinked, surprised by the concession. I owe you for my life. I continued, and I'm grateful for that. I am grateful you raised me. I am grateful for the childhood I had, even the parts that were hard. I leaned across the table, my face inches from hers. But gratitude is not a suicide pact, I whispered. And giving birth to me did not give you a lifetime license to destroy me. It did not give you the right to humiliate me in front of my daughter. It did not give you the right to lie about me to the world. I straightened up and addressed the room. A parent's job is to launch their child, I said, not to anchor them, not to feed off them. Marilyn didn't want me to succeed. She wanted me to fail, because as long as I was failing, she could feel superior. I looked back at her. You didn't love me, Mother. You loved the control you had over me, and tonight, you lost it. Marilyn stared at me, her breathing ragged. She looked at Howard, but he had his head in his hands. She looked at Jenna, but Jenna was looking at me with admiration. She looked at Kara, but Kara was studying the tablecloth. She was alone. I sat back down. I felt a sense of finality, a closing of a chapter that had gone on far too long. But I wasn't done. I had one more piece of paper in the portfolio, the one with the red tab, the one I had prayed I wouldn't have to use, but knew I would. Everyone thought the show was over. They thought I had made my point. They thought we would finish dessert in awkward silence and go home to our separate corners, but I wasn't going to let us go back to the status quo. I wasn't going to let them sleep in my house tonight thinking this was just a fight. I reached for the red tab. You wanted to talk about the future. Mother, I said, my voice dropping to a businesslike register. You mentioned a 30-day timeline for me to vacate if I didn't pay rent. Marilyn looked up, wary. Well, I said, pulling the document out, I think that is a very reasonable timeline. I slid the final document across the table. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't a receipt. It was a single page, typed on formal legal letterhead, with the words, Notice of Termination of Occupancy, centered in bold, black ink at the top. The room, which had just started to breathe again, held its collective breath once more. The document lay on the table between the untouched tiramisu and the wreckage of my mother's reputation. It was a single sheet of paper, crisp and white, with the letterhead of Sterling Vance. Attorneys at law centered at the top, but it was the bold, capitalized title that drew every eye in the room, acting like a gravitational singularity that pulled in all the light and air. Notice of Termination of Occupancy. I did not slide this one. I placed it. I set it down with the deliberate, heavy motion of a judge laying down a gavel. Howard stared at it. He did not touch it at first, as if he believed the paper itself might burn him. He squinted at the text, his lips moving silently, trying to process words that his brain refused to comprehend. "What is this?" he whispered. The tremor in his voice was so violent it shook his entire upper body. "It is exactly what it looks like. Dad," I said. My voice was devoid of anger now. It was cool, smooth, and terrified me slightly with its lack of emotion. "It is a legal notice terminating your residency at 1128 Hawthorne Ridge Drive." Marilyn made a sound that was half gasp, half snarl. She snatched the paper from the table, her fingernails crumpling the corner. She read it, her eyes widening until they looked like they might pop out of her skull. She choked. "You cannot do this." "I can," I said, "and I have." I leaned forward, clasping my hands on top of the leather portfolio. "You see," I continued, addressing the silent, stunned faces of my family. "I did not print this out tonight. I did not type this up in the car on the way over. Look at the date next to the attorney's signature." Marilyn looked. Her eyes darted to the top right corner. "May 12th, she read, her voice barely audible. "That was last Tuesday." I sat back, letting the implications sink in. "I went to see my lawyer, Sarah Vance, a week ago." I explained. "We sat in her office, we drank coffee, and we reviewed the situation. I told her that Jenna was graduating. I told her that the transitional period of my life, the period where I needed to keep the peace for the sake of my daughter, was coming to an end." I looked at Jenna. She was watching me with an expression of intense focus, like she was watching a masterclass in survival. I told Sarah that I hoped I would not have to use it. I told her that maybe, just maybe, on the night of her granddaughter's greatest achievement, Marilyn Vasquez would be able to put her ego aside for 3 hours. I told her that if you behaved, if you acted like a grandmother instead of a creditor, I would leave this document in the folder. I would let you stay in the house. I would let you keep your dignity. I turned my gaze back to Marilyn. It was a physical effort not to look away from the hatred burning in her eyes, but I held it. But I also told her that I know you. Mother, I told her that you cannot stand to see anyone else shine. I told her that you would likely try to make tonight about you, and I told her that if you tried to leverage your position, if you tried to humiliate me or extort me in front of the family, I needed to be ready to pull the trigger. Howard looked up from the table. He looked like a ghost. 30 days, he whispered. "It says we have 30 days. That is the statutory requirement in North Carolina for a tenancy at will." I said calmly, "Since there is no written lease, and since you pay no rent, you are considered tenants at will. The law requires a 30-day notice to vacate. You have until June 15th. Marilyn slammed the paper down. It made a sharp, cracking sound that caused Aunt Cara to jump. "You wouldn't dare," she screamed. The volume of her voice was shocking. It wasn't the controlled, passive-aggressive tone she usually used. It was the raw, guttural scream of a cornered predator. "You wouldn't dare throw your own parents out on the street. We are elderly. We are your family. People will crucify you." She looked around the room, desperate for validation. "Tell her she commanded the room. Tell her she is insane. Tell her she cannot do this to us." But no one spoke. No one moved to defend her. The silence was thick and heavy, like wet wool. I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I saw her not as a giant, but as a small, terrified woman who had overplayed her hand so badly she had bankrupted herself. "I would dare, Mother," I said softly. "And you know I would, because you just gave me the permission to do it." I stood up again, feeling the energy in the room shift entirely to my corner. "You want to know why I asked? It is not because of the money. I have spent $500,000 supporting you, and I would have spent $500,000 more if you had just been kind." I pointed a finger at her, not in anger, but in accusation. "But tonight, you did the one thing I cannot forgive. You looked at my daughter, my brilliant, hard-working daughter who just graduated with honors, and you tried to taint her night. You tried to make her feel like her mother was a failure. You tried to charge me rent in the house that I own, effectively trying to steal from the very inheritance that saved you 15 years ago." I took a breath. "You broke the contract. Marilyn, the unwritten one, the one that said, 'I pay for everything, and you provide a home.' Well, you just tried to charge me for the home I provide for you. So, the deal is off." I looked at Howard. "I am sorry. Dad, I truly am. But I cannot live with a tenant who tries to evict the landlord. It is bad business. And as you all learned tonight, I am very good at business." Derek cleared his throat. It was a dry, raspy sound. He reached out and took the notice from the table, reading it over with his professional eye. He nodded slowly, a gesture of resignation and grim acceptance. "She is right. Marilyn," Derek said. Marilyn whipped her head around to look at him, betrayal written on every line of her face. "Whose side are you on?" she hissed. "I am on the side of reality," Derek said heavily. He took off his glasses and set them on the tablecloth. "This isn't a tantrum, Marilyn. This is a legal eviction. And frankly," he paused, looking at me with a newfound respect in his eyes. "Frankly, this is not about what you said tonight. You can't evoke this kind of response with one sentence. This isn't revenge for a bad toast. This is the bill coming due for 15 years of humiliation." He gestured to the stack of papers, the deed, the tax records, the spreadsheet. "You pushed her, Marilyn. You pushed her, and you pushed her, assuming she would never push back because she was your daughter. You thought biology was a shield, but you forgot that she is also a human being. And you forgot that she is the one holding the keys." Marilyn looked at him, stunned. Then she looked at the rest of the table. She saw Aunt Kara nodding tearfully. She saw Cousin Mike looking down, unable to meet her gaze. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that the audience had left the theater. But I wasn't finished. There was one last nail to drive into the coffin of her narrative. I reached into the portfolio one last time. I didn't pull out a legal document. I pulled out a printout of an email. "I want you to understand something else," I said, my voice conversational again. "This isn't just about kicking you out. This is about asset management." I smoothed the paper on the table. "You mentioned that the market rent for a house like ours is $2,900. I said. "You were very proud of that number. You thought it was high. You thought it would hurt me." I smiled. A cold, sharp smile. "But you haven't been keeping up with the market. Mother, Hawthorne Ridge is a very desirable neighborhood now, and a 4-bedroom colonial with the upgrades I have paid for, it commands a premium." I held up the email. "This is from the Triangle Property Management Group. I had them do a rental assessment last week, just to see what my options were." I read from the paper, based on the square footage, the recent roof and HVAC upgrades, and the school district. They estimate the monthly rental value at $4,350 a month. Gasps echoed around the table. $4,350. It was a massive sum. They already have a waiting list. I added, "They have corporate clients relocating to Raleigh who are looking for exactly this kind of property. They have a tenant ready to sign a 2-year lease. Sight unseen." I looked at Marilyn. "So, when you demanded $2,900, you were actually undervaluing my asset by almost 30%, which is just another reason why you shouldn't be managing the finances." I placed the email on top of the eviction notice. I am not just evicting you because I'm angry. I said, I am evicting you because I have a business opportunity. Why should I subsidize you for free or pay you rent to live in my own house when I can move out, rent it to a corporate executive, and make over $50,000 a year in passive income? I looked at Howard. That money could pay for Jenna's PhD. I said, that money could fund my retirement. That money is my future, and I am done setting my future on fire to keep you warm. The logic was brutal. It was unassailable. I had taken the emotional drama of a family fight and turned it into a cold, hard business decision. I had stripped the sentimentality out of it. By framing it as a financial choice, I took away Marilyn's ability to argue based on family values. You can argue with a daughter. You cannot argue with a spreadsheet. Marilyn slumped in her chair. The fight had drained out of her. She looked small, old, and incredibly defeated. She realized that her power of storytelling, the ability to spin reality to suit her needs, had been completely neutralized. She couldn't go to the neighbors and say I kicked her out for no reason. I had receipts. I had a market analysis. I had a paper trail a mile long. If she told anyone I evicted her, I would just show them the deed and the rental offer. I would show them that I was a smart businesswoman making a rational decision. She had no story left to tell. Howard reached out and took Marilyn's hand. It was the first time he had touched her affectionately all night. We have to go. Marilyn, he said softly. No, she whispered. No. Howard. The house. It is not our house. Marilyn, he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. It never was. Not for a long time. He looked at me. We will figure it out. Reagan. We have some savings. Not much, but some. And we have the Social Security. You can find a nice 2-bedroom apartment for $1,800. I said helpfully, I can send you some listings. Marilyn looked up at me. Her eyes were dry now. The tears had stopped. I hate you, she said. It was a simple sentence. 3 words, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of resentment. I know, I said, and that is why we can't live together anymore. I zipped up the leather portfolio. The sound was loud in the quiet room. Zip. It was the sound of a body bag being closed. I stood up and signaled to the waiter, who had been hovering near the entrance to the private room, looking terrified. Check, please, I said. I looked down at my family one last time. Dinner is on me, I said. Consider it a parting gift. But the night wasn't quite over. As the waiter scurried away to print the bill, I saw Jenna looking at me. She wasn't looking at me like a daughter looks at a mother. She was looking at me like a soldier looks at a general who has just single-handedly won a war. And I knew, in that moment, that the real victory wasn't the house, it wasn't the money, it was the fact that for the first time in 22 years, my daughter saw me exactly as I was, not a victim, not a martyr, but a force of nature. However, Marilyn had one last gasp of venom left in her. She wasn't going to leave the table without trying to scorch the earth one last time, but she didn't know that I had already anticipated the fallout. She didn't know that the parting gift wasn't just the dinner bill, but for now. The eviction notice sat in the center of the table, a white flag of surrender that she had been forced to plant herself. Information travels fast in the South, but Marilyn's version of the truth traveled at the speed of light. By the time we left the restaurant parking lot, the narrative had already begun to mutate. The text messages started pinging on my phone before I even turned the ignition of my car. The first wave was predictable. It was the emotional shockwave. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in 3 years were suddenly very concerned about my spiritual well-being. How could you do this? One message read, "They are your parents." Another one, from a great aunt in Charleston, simply said, "Honor thy father and mother. This is a sin." I didn't reply. I drove Jenna home in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound between us. We both knew that the real storm wasn't the dinner. The real storm was the fallout. When we got back to the house on Hawthorne Ridge, the atmosphere was toxic. Marilyn and Howard had driven home separately, racing ahead to secure the territory. As I unlocked the front door using the key that I owned, I could hear Marilyn on the landline in the kitchen. Her voice was a high, thin wail, pitched perfectly to elicit maximum sympathy. She threw us out. Joyce Marilyn was sobbing into the receiver. On the street. Literally on the street. Reagan has gone crazy. She has been plotting this. She hates us. She is trying to destroy the family. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. She wasn't mentioning the deed. She wasn't mentioning the $492,000. She wasn't mentioning the fact that she had tried to extort rent from me 3 hours ago. She was painting a picture of a senile, helpless couple being victimized by a vindictive, money-hungry daughter. Jenna looked at me, her jaw tightening. "Do you want me to go in there?" she whispered. "No," I said, calm. "Let her talk. Words are free. Rent is not." I walked past the kitchen. Marilyn froze when she saw me, clutching the phone to her chest like a shield. She glared at me with eyes that were red and swollen, but I saw the calculation behind the tears. She was waiting for me to scream. She was waiting for me to rip the phone out of her hand so she could tell Joyce that I had assaulted her. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I just walked to the fridge, took out a bottle of sparkling water, and walked upstairs to my office. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. It was time to fight fire with data. I did not engage in text battles. I did not post on Facebook. Instead, I drafted a single email. I added the email addresses of every family member who had been at the dinner, plus the ones who were currently blowing up my phone. Subject clarification regarding 1128 Hawthorne Ridge Drive. The body of the email was short. Dear family, there seems to be some confusion regarding the events of this evening. I am attaching the notarized general warranty deed from 2011, the transfer of ownership agreement signed by Howard and Marilyn Vasquez, and a summary of household expenses paid by me over the last 15 years, totaling nearly $500,000. This is not a debate. This is a correction of the public record. Marilyn and Howard have been given 30 days to vacate a property they sold to me a decade and a half ago to avoid foreclosure. Any further harassment regarding this matter will be forwarded to my attorney. Regards, Reagan Miles. I hit send. Then I turned my phone to Do Not Disturb and went to sleep. The next morning, the dynamic in the house had shifted from explosive to glacial. The silence was heavy, physical, and suffocating. Marilyn refused to come out of the master bedroom. Howard moved through the house like a phantom, avoiding rooms that I was occupying. But the digital world was buzzing. My email had landed like a cluster bomb. The angry text stopped. The preaching stopped. When you show people a legal document stamped by the county clerk, it tends to suck the wind out of their moral outrage. Suddenly, the narrative of poor Marilyn had to compete with the PDF titled Foreclosure Rescue Agreement. Around 10 o'clock. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a soft knock on the doorframe. It was Howard. He looked terrible. He was wearing his bathrobe, his hair uncombed, his eyes sunken. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years overnight. "Reagan," he said softly. "Can we talk?" I poured my coffee. I didn't offer him any. "We can talk." "Dad," I said, "but if this is about extending the 30 days, the answer is no." He flinched. He walked into the kitchen and pulled out a chair. Sitting down heavily, he put his hands on the table, the same table where I had paid his bills for 15 years. "I didn't know it would go this far," he said. His voice was pleading. "I didn't know you were so angry." I turned around, leaning against the counter. "I am not angry. Dad," I said, "I am exhausted. There is a difference." He looked down at his hands. "Your mother is in a state. She says she is going to sue. She says she is going to call the police. She can call the Space Force if she wants." I said, "It won't change the deed." "Reagan, please," he said, looking up with watery eyes. "You have to understand her. She is proud. This house is her identity. If you take this away from her, it will kill her." I felt a flash of irritation. Even now, facing eviction, his priority was managing Marilyn's feelings. "What about my identity?" "Dad," I asked, "what about me?" For 15 years, my identity in this family has been the failure. My identity has been the leech, and you let her paint that picture. I didn't want to fight, he mumbled. No, I said sharply. You didn't want to fight her, so you sacrificed me. I walked over to the table and sat down opposite him. I needed him to hear this. I needed to puncture the bubble of his feigned ignorance. You came in here asking for mercy. I said, you say you didn't know it would go this far. But you were there, Dad. You were there when I wrote the check for $210,000. You were there when I paid for the roof. You were there every single time she made a passive-aggressive comment about me living under her roof at Christmas dinner. He looked away. I thought it was harmless. He whispered, I thought you didn't mind. You are so strong. Reagan, you always just took it. Because I was protecting Jenna, I slammed my hand on the table. I took it because I didn't want my daughter to know her grandparents were broke. I took it because I wanted her to have a normal childhood. I took a deep breath, lowering my voice. But you knew. You knew I was paying for the food you ate. You knew I was paying for the cable TV you watched. And yet, last night, when she demanded rent, you nodded. You said, fair is fair. Howard winced as if I had slapped him. That is why you have to go. Dad, I said coldly, not because of the money, but because when push came to shove, when you had to choose between the truth and your wife's ego, you chose the ego. You chose to let her extort me rather than stand up and say, no, Marilyn, this is Reagan's house. He sat there for a long time, the silence stretching between us. He knew I was right. He was a weak man who had mistaken his cowardice for peacemaking. I can't leave her, Reagan, he said finally. She is my wife. I nodded. I know. And I am not asking you to leave her. I am asking you to leave my house. He stood up slowly, looking defeated. He walked to the door, then paused. You are just like your grandmother Evelyn, he said. He meant it as an insult. I took it as a compliment. Thank you, I said. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Marilyn emerged from her room, but she didn't speak to me. She moved through the house with a manic energy, slamming cabinet doors, talking loudly on the phone to lawyers who I assumed were telling her things she didn't want to hear. Jenna became the new target. Since Marilyn couldn't break me, she tried to break the weakest link, or at least, who she thought was the weakest link. I was in the living room when Jenna walked in, looking furious. She threw her phone onto the couch. Aunt Kara just texted me. Jenna said, she said I should talk some sense into you. She said I need to remind you that family comes first and that I shouldn't let you throw my grandparents onto the street. What did you say? I asked, looking up from my book. Jenna picked up the phone and read her reply. I said, Aunt Kara, for 15 years you watched my mom pay for everything and let Grandma treat her like garbage. You didn't say family comes first then. Do not use me to fix a mess you all helped create. If you are so worried about where they are going to live, I assume you are offering up your guest room. I smiled. It was a vicious, beautiful response. Did she reply? I asked. Read 10:45 a.m. Jenna said. No response. Jenna sat down next to me. Grandma cornered me in the laundry room this morning. She said quietly. I stiffened. What did she say? She told me that you tricked them. She said you are mentally unstable and that you forged the papers. She said that if I testified against you in court, she would make sure I got the inheritance instead of you. I felt a cold rage settle in my stomach. Trying to bribe my daughter against me, it was a new low, and I asked. Jenna shrugged. I told her that I saw the bank statements. Grandma, I told her I know how to read a ledger, and I told her that if she tries to sue you, I will stand up in court and list every single thing you have ever paid for, down to the brand of toothpaste she uses. She leaned her head on my shoulder. She called me ungrateful, Jenna said, just like she called you. I put my arm around her. You are not ungrateful, I said. You are observant. There is a difference. The 30-day clock was ticking. Each day was a mark on the calendar that hung in the kitchen, a calendar Marilyn refused to look at. On day 5, the legal threat finally materialized. But it didn't come in the form of a lawsuit. It came in the form of a phone call from Uncle Derek. Reagan. Derek said. His voice was weary. Hello? Derek, I said. Are you calling to tell me I am a bad daughter? No, he said. I am calling to tell you that Marilyn is trying to hire a forensic accountant. I laughed. Good luck. My books are cleaner than her conscience. I know, Derek said. I told her that. I told her she is wasting her money she doesn't have. By the way, she tried to get me to lend her $5,000 for a retainer, and I asked. I told her no, Derek said. The silence on the line was heavy. This was a major shift. Derek had been Howard's best friend for 40 years. I read the deed. Reagan. Derek continued. And I read that email you sent. The spreadsheet. Jesus, Reagan, I knew you helped them out, but I didn't know you were carrying the whole load. $490,000, give or take. I said, I asked Howard about the car payments. Derek said, I asked him straight up. Did Reagan pay for that Lexus? And he couldn't look me in the eye. He sighed. You were right. Reagan, I am sorry I didn't see it sooner. I am sorry I sat there at dinner and let her talk to you like that. It is okay. Derek, I said, you know now. Yeah, he said, I know now. And I told Marilyn that if she sues you, she is going to lose. I told her that the deed is ironclad. I told her that the undue influence argument won't work because she signed a separate affidavit. I used to work in real estate. Remember, I know a watertight closing when I see one. So what is she going to do? I asked. She is panicking, Derek said. She is realizing that her bluff has been called. She thought you would cave. She thought the pressure would break you. But now that the family knows the truth, she has lost her audience. Nobody is buying the poor Marilyn act anymore, not after seeing that spreadsheet. He paused. She is going to leave. Reagan, she has to, but she is going to make it as painful as possible. I looked around my living room. I looked at the walls I had painted. I looked at the floors I had refinished. I can handle pain. Derek, I said, I have had 15 years of practice. The tension in the house ratcheted up as the days turned into weeks. Boxes began to appear in the hallway, not because Marilyn was packing willingly, but because I had hired a moving coordinator to drop them off. I wasn't going to give them the excuse of we didn't have supplies every time I walked past a stack of flattened cardboard boxes. It felt like a small victory, but Marilyn wasn't done. If she couldn't win legally, and she couldn't win socially, she was going to try to win historically. She started going through the house, claiming items. That vase is mine, she would shout if I walked near the dining room credenza. That painting belonged to my mother, I didn't argue. I let her tag things with blue painter's tape. I didn't care about the stuff. I cared about the space. I cared about the peace that would fill the vacuum once she was gone. One evening, about 2 weeks into the notice period, I came home to find Howard in the garage. He was standing in front of his workbench, looking at a collection of old tools. He didn't hear me approach. He was holding a hammer, an old, wooden-handled claw hammer. He was rubbing his thumb over the handle, lost in thought. It was a moment of profound sadness. He was a man who was losing his kingdom, a kingdom he had pretended to rule while his daughter paid the rent. You can take the tools, Dad, I said softly. He jumped, nearly dropping the hammer. He turned to look at me, his eyes red. I built the deck with this, he said. I know, I said, and I paid for the lumber to repair it last year. He nodded slowly. He put the hammer into a box. She found a place, he said. His voice was barely a whisper. Oh, I asked. I kept my face neutral. A condo, he said. Over in Nightdale. It is small. 2 bedrooms. It is nice enough. Nightdale was 30 minutes away. Far enough to be inconvenient. Close enough to visit if I ever decided I wanted to, which I currently didn't. Can you afford it? I asked. It is $1,700 a month, he said. We can manage. Barely. But we can manage. Good, I said. He looked at me, and for a second, I thought he was going to apologize. I thought he was going to say, Reagan, I am sorry I failed you. I am sorry I let her hurt you. But he didn't. He just looked at the box of tools. She wants to take the chandelier in the dining room, he said. I sighed. The chandelier is a fixture. Dad, I said, legally, it stays with the house, but tell her to take it. If it means you leave a day earlier, she can have the damn light. He nodded. Thank you. He walked past me, into the house, back to his wife, back to the misery he had chosen. I stood in the garage, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. I looked at the calendar on the wall. 14 days left. The countdown continued. The family group chat remained silent, but the individual messages of support started to trickle in. A cousin asking if I wanted to grab a drink. An aunt sending a recipe. Small gestures of realignment. They were realizing that the power had shifted. The checkbook was closed, and the truth was out. But as the final week approached, I knew Marilyn had one last card to play. She wouldn't leave quietly. She would want a scene. She would want an exit that would sear itself into my memory. I was ready for it. I had my receipts. I had my deed. And most importantly, I had the absolute certainty that for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was going to be left cleaning up the mess. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the dinner and the subsequent fallout had finally begun to ebb, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. It was 2 a.m. The house on Hawthorne Ridge was silent in a way it had never been before. It was not the peaceful silence of sleep. It was the heavy, suspended silence of a ceasefire. Marilyn and Howard had retreated to their bedroom hours ago, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a lock turning in a jail cell. I sat at the kitchen island, my hands wrapped around a mug of herbal tea that had long since gone tepid. Across from me sat Jenna. She was still wearing her graduation dress, though the sash that read Honors was draped over the back of the chair like a discarded flag after a battle. The only sound in the room was the low, rhythmic hiss of the kettle cooling down on the stove. There were no more applause, no more camera flashes, no more shouting, just the two of us, sitting in the wreckage of the family structure we had known for 22 years, Mom Jenna said. Her voice was small, scratching against the silence. I looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, stripped of the earlier defiance she had shown her grandmother. She looked very young again, like the little girl who used to ask me to check under the bed for monsters. Tonight, she had learned that the monsters were not under the bed. They were sitting at the dining table demanding rent. Yeah. Sweetie? I answered. Why did you do it? She asked. I blinked. Confused? Do what? Why did I serve the notice? No, she said, shaking her head. Why did you wait so long? She traced the rim of her mug with a fingernail. You had the deed for 15 years. You had the money. You had the job. You could have kicked them out a decade ago. You could have moved us out. We could have lived in a condo or a different house. We could have been free of the comments, the guilt trips, the constant feeling that we were imposing. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine for a logic she couldn't quite grasp. Why did you stay in the burning building when you held the fire extinguisher the whole time? It was the question I had been asking myself since I put the eviction notice on the table at the restaurant. It was the question that kept me awake at night. I took a sip of the cold tea, because I kept hoping the story would change. I said softly. Jenna frowned. What do you mean? I mean that I didn't want to win by contract. I explained. I wanted to win by character. I looked toward the dark hallway that led to my parents' room. I thought that if I stayed, if I paid the bills, if I was kind, if I raised you well, I thought that eventually they would have to see me. I thought that one day Marilyn would wake up, look at the woman paying for her roof and her car, and say, Thank you, Reagan. You did good. I laughed. A dry, brittle sound. I wanted them to see me as a person. Jenna. Not as the rebellious teenager who got pregnant. Not as the failure who came home. I wanted to be real to them. I thought that if I endured the humiliation long enough, I would earn my way out of the penalty box. And Jenna asked. And tonight I realized that to them, I am not a person. I said, I am a character in a play that Marilyn wrote in her head, in her story. She is the hero, and I am the villain. No amount of money, no amount of success, no amount of sacrifice will ever change the script. The only way to change the ending was to burn the theater down. Jenna nodded slowly. She reached across the table and took my hand. You are real to me. Mom, she whispered. I squeezed her hand. I know, and that is the only thing that matters anymore. I stood up. The movement made my joints pop. I walked over to the kitchen counter where I had left the leather portfolio. It looked innocent enough, just a worn piece of business equipment, but we both knew it was a weapon of mass destruction. There is one more thing, I said. Jenna sat up straighter. More, Mom. Please tell me you didn't buy the country club too. I smiled faintly. No, nothing like that. I brought the portfolio back to the table and sat down. I unzipped it again. The sound was familiar now, a signal that another layer of the onion was about to be peeled back. I flipped past the blue tab of the deed. I flipped past the green tab of the taxes. I went all the way to the back, to a small, unassuming tab that was clear. I hadn't opened this section at the restaurant. It wasn't for Marilyn. It wasn't for Howard. It was for the girl sitting across from me. I pulled out a slender file and slid it toward Jenna. You heard me talk about Grandma Evelyn tonight, I said. You heard that she left me the money that saved this house. Jenna nodded. $235,000. Right, I said. But that wasn't all she left. Jenna froze, her hand hovering over the file. Grandma Evelyn was a smart woman, I said. She knew her daughter, your grandmother Marilyn, very well. She knew that if she left money to Marilyn, it would be spent on clothes and cars and keeping up appearances, and she worried that if she left money to me, Marilyn might guilt me into handing it over. I pointed to the file. So she created a bypass, a redundancy. Jenna opened the file. Inside was a statement from Vanguard. What is this? She whispered. It is a trust. I said, the Evelyn Hart, Educational and Welfare Trust. Beneficiary. Jenna Miles, Trustee Reagan Miles. Jenna scanned the document. Her eyes widened as they hit the bottom line. $62,000. She read, her voice trembling. $62,418. Grandma Evelyn left you $20,000 when she died. I explained. I put it into a low-risk index fund. I added a little bit to it every month, $50 here. $100 there whenever I got a bonus or saved on groceries. I let the compound interest do the work. Jenna looked up, tears spilling over her lashes. Mom, she choked out. I kept it secret. I said, my voice fierce. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to learn how to work. I wanted you to work in that library. I wanted you to understand the value of $1, unlike your grandmother. But mostly, I didn't tell you because I didn't want them to know. I leaned forward, and that brings me to the twist you need to know. Jenna, because you need to understand exactly who we are dealing with. Jenna wiped her eyes. What do you mean Marilyn knew about the possibility of this money? I said, she didn't know for sure, but she suspected. Evelyn had mentioned taking care of the baby before she died. I took a deep breath. Over the last 10 years, Marilyn has tried to access this account 4 times. Jenna gasped. What? She went to the bank. I said, she used her maiden name. She tried to tell the tellers she was the trustee. She tried to say she lost the paperwork. She even tried to guilt a family friend who works at the downtown branch into looking up the account number for her. Jenna looked horrified. She looked at the hallway again, as if she could see the greed radiating from the master bedroom. She tried to steal from me, Jenna whispered. A child. She tried to manage it for you, I corrected, using Marilyn's likely vocabulary. She probably told herself she would invest it better, or that the family needed it for emergencies like a new Lexus. I tapped the file, but she couldn't touch it, because I set it up so that it required 2 signatures, mine and a lawyer's. I built a firewall around your future. Jenna, I knew that one day you would need a nest egg. Maybe for a house, maybe for a wedding, maybe just to have the freedom to say no to a boss you hate. Jenna looked at the number again. $62,000. To a 22-year-old just starting out, it was a fortune. It was security. It was the difference between panic and peace. She looked at me, and her face crumbled. She wasn't crying because of the cash. She was crying because she finally understood the architecture of my love. It wasn't just hugs and packed lunches. It was legal structures. It was compound interest. It was 15 years of silence to protect a secret that would one day set her free. You did all this. She sobbed. You were fighting a war every day, and I didn't even know it. A mother's job is to catch the grenade. I said softly, not to let the child see the pin being pulled. Jenna stood up and came around the island. She wrapped her arms around me, burying her face in my neck. She smelled like vanilla and the expensive hairspray she had worn for graduation. I held her tight, feeling the shudder of her breathing against my ribs. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving me." I kissed the top of her head. "You are worth saving, kiddo." We stayed like that for a long time, the kitchen clock ticking away the seconds of the old life. Finally, Jenna pulled back. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. And I saw something new in her eyes. It was steel. It was the same look Grandma Evelyn used to have. "So, what happens tomorrow?" she asked. Her voice was steady now. I closed the portfolio. "Tomorrow. We stick to the process." I said, "Marilyn is going to try to cause a scene. She is going to try to rally the troops. She has probably already called a family meeting for noon. I let them have it." Jenna asked. "No." I said, "We attend, but we do not engage. I am not going to argue with her about who did what in 1995. I am not going to debate my worth as a daughter. I am simply going to reiterate the timeline. June 15th. That is the only date that matters." Jenna nodded. "If she comes at you," Jenna said, "I am going to speak up. I am going to tell everyone about the trust fund. I am going to tell them she tried to steal from her own granddaughter." I shook my head. "No, Jenna, you don't have to. I want to," she interrupted. Her jaw was set. "You protected me for 22 years. Mom, let me protect you for 10 minutes. If she tries to rewrite the story tomorrow, I am going to read the footnotes." I looked at her. She wasn't asking for permission. She was stating a fact. She was an adult now, fully formed, forged in the fire of this family drama. "Okay," I said softly. "We stand together. Together." She agreed. She picked up her mug to put it in the sink. The clock on the microwave read 2:45. The house was settling. The drama of the evening felt like it was finally winding down. And then, the sound cut through the quiet house like a knife. Ding-dong. We both froze. It was the front doorbell. It wasn't the sound of a key turning in the lock. It wasn't the sound of the garage door opening. It was the chime of a visitor, the chime of a stranger. Jenna looked at me, her eyes wide. "Who is ringing the doorbell at 3 a.m? I looked toward the front door. I knew who it wasn't. It wasn't the police. They would have pounded. It wasn't a delivery. Then I realized what it meant. It was a symbol. Someone was out there, perhaps a family member who had driven over. Perhaps Howard returning from a late-night walk to clear his head. Or perhaps even Marilyn herself, locking herself out in a fit of rage, finding themselves unable to enter. But the specific sound mattered. For 40 years. People in this family had walked through that door without knocking. They had treated this house as communal property. They had treated my space as their space. But tonight, for the first time, the door was locked to them. Tonight, they had to ring the bell. Tonight, they had to ask for permission to enter the kingdom of Reagan Miles. I looked at Jenna. "Go upstairs," I said quietly. She hesitated. "Mom, go," I repeated. "I will handle this." She nodded and slipped silently toward the stairs. I walked to the foyer. The bell rang again. Ding-dong, impatient, entitled, but ultimately powerless. I reached for the door handle, feeling the cold metal under my palm. I took a deep breath, preparing to face whatever was on the other side. The era of the open door was over. The era of the landlord had begun. The morning of June 15th did not begin with a shout. It began with the quiet, efficient scratch of a pen on paper. I sat in the office of Sarah Vance, my attorney, and watched as she compiled the final dossier. There were no theatrics here. There was only the dull, bureaucratic weight of the law. We filed the unlawful detainer complaint. just as a precaution. But we both knew it likely wouldn't come to a sheriff's escort. The threat alone had done the heavy lifting. "Everything is in order," Sarah said, closing the file. "You have the right to retake possession at noon today. If they are not out, we call the authorities. It is that simple." It felt sterile. It felt clean. It was the exact opposite of the messy, emotional sprawl that Marilyn had tried to create. I drove back to Hawthorne Ridge Drive with a sense of calm that scared me slightly. I pulled into the driveway at 11:30. There were 3 cars parked there. One belonged to Uncle Derek, one belonged to Aunt Kara, and one belonged to Cousin Mike. Marilyn had convened a tribunal. She had called a final family meeting in a desperate attempt to shame me into submission in the final hour. She wanted an audience for her martyrdom. She wanted witnesses to her eviction. I walked to the front door. I didn't ring the bell. I used my key. The lock tumbled smoothly, a mechanical reminder of who held the power. I stepped into the foyer. The house smelled of lavender and tension. I could hear them in the living room. Marilyn was crying, a low, keening sound that she projected for maximum acoustic effect. "She is throwing us out. Kara," I heard her wail. "After everything we did for her, she is sending her own parents to the homeless shelter." I walked into the living room. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a cold draft, "I am sending you to a very nice 2-bedroom condo in Nightdale, provided you sign the papers." The room went silent. Marilyn looked up, her face blotchy and swollen. She was sitting on the sofa, clutching a tissue. Howard sat next to her, looking at his shoes. The relatives were scattered around the room like uncomfortable furniture. "You have some nerve showing your face," Marilyn spat. "I have every right to show my face," I corrected her. "This is my house, and as of 30 minutes from now, you are trespassing." I walked to the center of the room and placed a folder on the coffee table. Marilyn looked at the family. "You see," she screamed, "you see how cold she is. She calls her parents trespassers." She turned to Howard. "Tell them, Howard. Tell them how she tricked us. Tell them how she stole the house from under us while we were grieving." It was the lie she had been piloting for weeks. The idea that she was mentally incapacitated when she signed the deed. I looked at my father. He looked gray. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying a boulder on his back for 15 years and was finally realizing he could just put it down. "Howard," I said softly, "it is over. The deed is public record. The bank statements are public record. There is no more story to tell." Howard looked at Marilyn. Then he looked at Derek, his best friend, who was watching him with a mixture of pity and judgment. "Tell them," Marilyn hissed, digging her fingernails into his arm. Howard pulled his arm away. He stood up. It was a slow, painful movement, but he stood. "She didn't trick us." "Marilyn," Howard said. His voice was quiet, but in the silence of the room, it sounded like a gunshot. Marilyn froze. "What did you say?" "I said she didn't trick us," Howard repeated, louder this time. "We begged her. We begged her for the money. We were going to lose the house. The bank was calling every day. I was the one who drove the papers to her office. I was the one who asked her to save us." Gasps rippled through the room. Aunt Kara put her hand over her mouth. Howard Marilyn shrieked. "You are confused. I am not confused," Howard shouted, his voice breaking. "I am tired. I am tired of the lies. Marilyn, I am tired of pretending we are rich when we are broke. I am tired of treating Reagan like a villain when she saved our lives." He looked at the family, tears streaming down his face. "She paid for everything," he sobbed. "The car, the food, the roof, even the vacation to Myrtle Beach last year. Reagan paid for it, and we just took it, and we let you think she was a failure because we were too ashamed to admit we needed her." The truth hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. Marilyn's narrative didn't just crack, it evaporated. She sat there, her mouth open, looking around the room for an ally, but finding only averted gazes. "You," she whispered, "you traitor." Howard sat back down, putting his head in his hands. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The silence did the work for me. But Marilyn was cornered, and a cornered narcissist attacks the only thing left: morality. You think you are so superior. She sneered at me, wiping her face. You think because you have money, you are a good person, you are ungrateful. Reagan, that is what you are. You are ungrateful for the life we gave you. You are ungrateful for the sacrifices we made. You are taking the labor of our lives and throwing it in the trash. I looked at her, feeling a strange sense of pity. Ungrateful, I asked. No, Mother. Ungrateful is taking someone's life savings and calling it a loan you never intend to pay back. Ungrateful is taking the credit for someone else's success. Ungrateful is using your daughter's hard work to paint a mask over your own failures. I took a step closer. I am not ungrateful. I said, I am just done being your ATM. You owe me, she screamed. I am your mother. And that is when the front door opened. Everyone turned. Jenna walked in. She wasn't wearing her graduation dress today. She was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and she was holding a box of packing tape. She walked into the living room, stood next to me, and looked down at her grandmother. Jenna, Marilyn said, her voice changing instantly to a sugary, manipulative tone. Honey, please, tell your mother she is making a mistake. Tell her not to do this to family. Jenna didn't smile. She didn't flinch. You told Mom she had to pay rent, Jenna said calmly. You said it was to teach her responsibility. Marilyn blinked. That was just a lesson. Okay, Jenna said. Well, Mom has been responsible for this family for 15 years. She paid the mortgage. She paid the taxes. She paid for my college. She paid for your car. Jenna leaned forward. So, if you want to talk about responsibility, Grandma, why don't you pay her back if you return the $492,000 she spent on you? I am sure she will let you stay. Marilyn stared at her granddaughter. She realized then that the infection of truth had spread to the next generation. She had lost Jenna, too. Jenna stood up straight. But until you write that check, Jenna said, you are just a guest who overstayed her welcome. And the checkout time was noon. It was the final blow. Marilyn slumped back into the sofa, defeated. I stepped forward to deliver the final arrangement. I wasn't going to leave them on the street. That wasn't who I was. I needed to win. But I needed to win with my humanity intact. Here's the deal, I said, pointing to the folder on the table. I have listed this house for rent. I announced, the new tenants move in on July 1st. They are paying $4,350 a month. Marilyn flinched at the number. I am not keeping the first year's profit. I continued. I am taking the first 6 months of rental income that is roughly $26,000, and I am putting it directly into an escrow account for you. Howard looked up. What I have arranged a lease for you at the Rolling Meadows complex in Nightdale. I said, it is a ground floor unit, 2 bedrooms, safe, clean. The rent is $1,700 a month. I have used the profit from this house to pay your deposit and your rent for the next year. I looked at Marilyn. You have a year of free rent. Mother, a year to figure out your budget. A year to live within your means. After that, you are on your own. I pushed the folder toward them, but this offer comes with a condition. You sign the voluntary vacate agreement now. You hand over the keys now, and you leave the fixtures, the chandelier, the curtains, the appliances exactly where they are. If you damage 1 inch of this house on your way out, the deal is void, and I will sue you for every penny of the damages. I crossed my arms. It is a business offer. Take it or leave it. The room was silent. Derek looked at the papers, then looked at me. Reagan, Derek said, his voice thick with emotion. That is more than generous. He looked at Marilyn. Sign the paper. Marilyn, sign it now before she changes her mind. Marilyn looked at the folder. She looked at the house she had claimed was hers for 40 years. She looked at the daughter she had called a failure, and she realized that the failure was now her landlord, her banker, and her savior. She didn't apologize. She didn't say thank you. She just reached out, took the pen Howard offered her, and signed the paper with a shaky, angry hand. She stood up. She didn't look at me. She walked past me, past Jenna, and out the front door without a word. Her silence was toxic, a cloud of bitterness that trailed behind her. but it was silence nonetheless. Howard stayed behind for a moment. He signed the paper, then he stood up and looked at me. "I am sorry." "Reagan," he whispered. I nodded. "I know. Dad." He walked out. Jenna followed him to the door, handing him the box of personal items we had packed for them. The relatives stood up. Aunt Kara came over to me. She looked ashamed. "I didn't know." "Reagan," she said, "I really didn't know. It is okay." "Kara," I said, "now you do?" They filed out, one by one, leaving the house quiet. Jenna and I stood in the empty living room. The furniture was still there, but the energy was different. The heavy, oppressive weight of Marilyn's judgment was gone. The air felt lighter. Jenna looked at me. "You gave them a year of rent," she asked. I shrugged. "It is passive income." "Jenna, it is not coming out of my pocket. It is coming out of the house, and frankly, it is worth $26,000 to buy my freedom." She smiled. "You are a genius." "No," I said, "I am just a data analyst who finally corrected the error in the system." We walked to the front door together. I looked back at the hallway, at the kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals, at the stairs I had climbed 1,000,000 times. For 15 years, I had walked through this house feeling like a ghost, asking permission to exist. But today, the walls didn't whisper judgment. They just stood there, solid and owned. I stepped out onto the porch. Jenna was waiting by the car. We were going to celebrate with a late lunch, just the two of us. I reached for the door handle. I pulled it shut. The latch clicked a solid, definitive sound. I locked the deadbolt. I put the key in my pocket. It sat there, heavy and cool against my hip. It wasn't revenge. Revenge is messy. Revenge is emotional. This was simply a correction. I had balanced the books. I had closed the account. And as I walked down the driveway toward my daughter, toward the future that belonged to us, I finally felt the one thing I had been chasing for 4 decades. I felt like an adult. And the rent. The rent was finally paid in full. Thank you so much for listening to Reagan's story of reclaiming her dignity in her home. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Drop a comment below with your city or country. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Emma Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this video get recommended to more people who need to see justice served. See you in the next story.